Before the mid-70s, welding an oil pipeline dozens of meters below the North Sea meant entering a regulatory vacuum where safety depended entirely on whoever was signing the check, leading to an alarming rate of fatalities. It paints a vivid picture of commercial diving's early days, doesn't it? A profession that felt like reading accounts of a gold rush, utterly devoid of guarantees. Julian, can you describe that environment for us?
It was truly chaotic. The sudden demand for underwater labor, driven by offshore oil exploration, far outstripped any existing training structure. Operators were recruited from sport divers or ex-military personnel, and companies, keen to minimize platform costs, pushed them to their physiological limits. Equipment was rudimentary, and decompression tables were treated as suggestions, not strict physical limits. There wasn't any universal standard to assess who was genuinely qualified to go deep.
That casual approach to decompression tables is quite unsettling. Human biology makes no compromises with water pressure. So, beyond the simple drive for profit, how did companies justify such a blatant disregard for basic hyperbaric medicine rules simply to speed up operations?
Economic pressure was certainly a primary driver, but there was also a severe lack of applied medical knowledge outside of naval environments. James Joyner, a pioneer in hyperbaric medicine and co-founder of the International Diving Schools Association, or IDSA, understood this. He'd studied zoology, chemistry, and medicine at UCLA. Joyner realized military protocols couldn't just be transferred to civilians. The military completed missions and returned to base, whereas an industrial diver had to work for hours every day for weeks on end. He observed that without international standards, a diver trained in one country could face completely unfamiliar equipment and procedures in another, dramatically increasing the risk of fatal accidents.
It seems that moving from such unregulated chaos to a system of rules almost always requires some catalytic force. In this case, historical records point to union action. In 1975, the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners of America petitioned the U.S. government for an emergency standard. Was this union pressure fundamental in prompting OSHA to intervene?
Absolutely. Unions provided that initial political push, documenting unacceptable accident rates. This led OSHA to issue temporary rules in 1976, and then permanent standards for commercial diving in 1977. Jim Joyner himself collaborated on drafting those diving standards for OSHA and the U.S. Coast Guard.
While this state intervention set a minimum safety floor, it created a new global problem. Every nation started developing its own isolated rules. You had Norwegians and Britons operating in the same North Sea oil fields, but following contradictory manuals. The IDSA was founded in 1982 in New Orleans specifically to resolve this dangerous fragmentation.
Harmonizing rules between nations with often conflicting economic interests must have generated strong tensions. If IDSA wanted to impose a unified training standard, it would mean forcing diving schools and contractors to modify programs, invest more resources, and prolong training times. Companies that benefited from cheap labor and minimal training would surely have resisted. What kind of technical and cultural resistances did IDSA face in standardizing procedures internationally?
Contractors, often represented by organizations like the International Marine Contractors Association, or IMCA, viewed prolonged training with suspicion, fearing unjustified cost increases. IDSA, with prominent figures like Alan Bax in Europe and Jim Joyner in the US, had to demonstrate with hard data that standardized training actually reduced insurance premiums and downtime due to accidents. They introduced the IDSA Q card, which certifies a diver's skills globally. To issue this card, schools have to pass a rigorous audit. It wasn't just about swimming ability anymore. It tested engineering skills like underwater welding, bell emergency management, and surface safety procedures.
The Q card sounds like an ingenious mechanism to force the industry's hand. If major schools start issuing a universal certification, contractors would be compelled to prefer divers who possess it.
to protect themselves from legal liability. Hiring an operator without a cue card following a fatal accident could easily be seen as blatant negligence. But this also creates a de facto monopoly on training. Entrusting the definition of primary standards to a private association raises questions of governance and accessibility, especially for workers in developing countries who might not be able to afford those specific schools.
That question of accessibility is a debated point of friction. Training an industrial diver to full qualification does require substantial funds. However, IDSA doesn't aim to replace national laws. It acts as a global equivalence table. For example, IDSA standards are officially recognized by the legislations of Denmark, Norway, and Italy.
Schools in emerging countries such as Middle East for commercial diving in Egypt or new facilities in Singapore can align with these standards and receive certifications. This ensures their graduates have the same job opportunities as an operator trained in Scotland. This standardization has truly transformed the diver from an expendable worker into a specialized hyperbaric technician.
That transformation is significant. Speaking of advanced certifications, we're also talking about equipment. IDSA protocols had to manage the shift from autonomous scuba diving to surface-supplied diving. Modern commercial diving shuns scuba, preferring systems where air or specific gas mixtures are pumped through an umbilical, which also provides direct voice communications and hot water to heat the suit. Was this technological change imposed by regulations, or did technology drive the rules forward?
Technology and rules have progressed in a continuous exchange. In the early days, many fatal injuries resulted from scuba use in near-zero visibility or strong currents, where a diver could get lost or run out of air unnoticed. Hyperbaric medicine experts insisted on the umbilical because it allowed for constant vital monitoring. The surface supervisor could listen to the diver's breathing rhythm, verify exact depth, and control gas supply. IDSA standards codified these empirical practices, establishing that hardwired communications and surface gas supply are non-negotiable minimum requirements for industrial operations.
The adoption of the umbilical fundamentally alters the psychology of underwater work. The diver loses independence and becomes an extension of the support vessel's apparatus. Total dependence on the surface team sets in, with the supervisor acting as the operations mind and the diver as its executive arm. But before we explore that command dynamic, I'd like to focus on some other specific physical risks IDSA had to include in its manuals. Decompression sickness is often cited, but industrial divers face much more sudden hydrodynamic hazards like differential pressures. How have schools standardized training for obstacles that are often invisible in the mud of the seafloor?
Differential pressure, or delta P as it's known in the field, is one of the most insidious hazards. It occurs when two bodies of water at different pressure levels coexist, separated by a gap. Water tries to level itself with overwhelming force. If a diver inadvertently positions himself near an open valve on a pipe or a crack in a dam, they're sucked against the opening with a force of several tons. There's no human escape without mechanical intervention to stop the flow upstream. Before regulations, these scenarios were avoided only through word of mouth among veterans. IDSA made the theoretical study and practical simulation of fluid mechanics mandatory. Candidates now learn to identify potential delta P scenarios by analyzing site engineering diagrams before even entering the water.
This demand for analytical calculation elevates the required preparation far beyond mere physical prowess. It demands the ability to read marine structural projects, shifting the worker's image from an uninhibited adventurer to that of an operational surveyor. And then there's gas neurotoxicity. Beyond certain depths, normal air becomes poisonous. Nitrogen triggers narcosis, oxygen becomes toxic, causing convulsions. Training, promoted by figures like Jim Joyner, had to discipline human biology with the same severity as it disciplined pipe welding.
The chemical composition of breathing gases is at the heart of advanced training. Beyond 50 meters, compressed nitrogen generates narcosis, impairing clinical judgment much like alcohol intoxication. A diver experiencing narcosis loses the clarity needed for precision work like thermal metal cutting. The technical solution uses mixtures of helium and oxygen, known as heliox. However, helium introduces its own challenges. It disperses body heat rapidly, leading to hypothermia, and alters sound propagation, making voices incomprehensible. Training protocols mandate hot water suits and electronic voice decoders. Through his publishing house, Best Publishing Company, Joyner disseminated essential manuals on these hyperbaric challenges to schools worldwide.
The tangible impact of Joyner's publications truly deserves attention. Disseminating advanced medical notions, making them accessible to those working in the trenches, is a crucial act of worker protection. A detailed manual of hyperbaric medicine equips the operator with the conceptual tools to recognize their own biological limits, reducing the chances of an employer manipulating dive times at the expense of health. It restores informational symmetry.
Despite this, rigorously adhering to physiological limits requires monumental infrastructure. Saturation diving, for example, forces teams to live in pressurized environments for weeks aboard ships, descending to the seabed via a closed bell. Does this extreme level of operability fall within the school's evaluation procedures?
The IDSA training path is structured progressively, from shallow water diving up to closed bell diving for the deep sea. Saturation diving marks the pinnacle of this technical progression. The funds needed to certify an institute to teach bell diving are exorbitant, as they require the installation and maintenance of saturation complexes solely for teaching purposes. This entry barrier significantly selects the training centers, but that selection guarantees vital safety. If a saturation operator suffers severe trauma at 150 meters depth, decompression to bring them safely to the surface would take many days. A rushed emergency evacuation would cause fatal outcomes due to the rapid expansion of gases in their tissues. Every single valve or gasket must be managed with millimetric precision.
The inherent impossibility of an immediate evacuation defines a terrifying work environment. Saturation divers inhabit an isolated space, separated from Earth's atmospheric pressure by a thick stainless steel bulkhead. They're spatially close to the ocean surface, but days away temporally from being able to breathe unassisted. This claustrophobic isolation makes the training of medical figures within the support team absolutely crucial. The diving medical technician becomes the only responder capable of operating. If the nearest hospital can't receive the patient due to body pressure, hospital functions must be transferred to the hyperbaric modules on the ship.
This explains the meticulousness of IDSA standards for training medical support personnel. The medical technician must possess skills to formulate complex diagnoses, insert venous access, administer specific pharmacological treatment for the hyperbaric environment, and manage resuscitation maneuvers with remote guidance from a specialist doctor. All this happens while communicating through control panel microphones and transferring medical devices through the small compensation locks of the chambers. Many world government authorities have adopted the text edited by Joyner as the cornerstone of their own national health and safety regulations. This layering of skills has elevated a once improvised trade to a complex underwater mission, analogous to aerospace procedures.
That parallel with the aerospace sector frames the nature of the work incredibly well. In both scenarios, specialized individuals operate in environments lethal to human life, supported by a complex and vulnerable technological chain. And just as spacecraft design was rewritten following devastating accidents, commercial diving established its rules by analyzing past failures. IDSA serves as a global archive of these lessons, paid for at a very high price. When schools from different nations unify evaluation criteria and share operational data, they form a systemic defense against negligence and error. Standardization truly assumes the role of a collective protective shield.
That normative basis has enabled the global scalability of the marine energy sector. Without shared guidelines, underwater operations would be fragmented, forcing every site to reinvent prevention measures and raising the risk margins at unacceptable levels. The equivalence tables managed by IDSA allow a team of Norwegian, Scottish and US operators to meet on a platform in the Gulf of Mexico and interact with a uniform technical language from day one. They know the exact order of pre-dive checks performed by the supervisor, recognize pull signals on the umbilical, and predict mutual behavior during a technical failure. This operational fluidity prevents tragedies long before an emergency manifests. Jim Joyner spent his entire career ensuring this organizational harmony became the rule in every ocean.
The value of this organizational work emerges clearly when we consider the historical alternative. Without the tenacity of those who impose the drafting of medical manuals, the rigor of practical exams, and the supervision of training centers, the modern offshore oil and civil industry simply couldn't have sustained its expansion rates. The stability of the underwater infrastructure upon which our global energy network relies depends on technicians capable of descending to the ocean floor and returning to the surface thanks to these constantly updated rules. We've traced an evolution from the turbulent and unprotected waters of the first decades of exploration, highlighting the role of organizations like IDSA and the impact of hyperbaric medicine on the protection of life. Share this episode with those around you to discuss how safety in extreme professions requires years of sacrifice and regulatory battles to be achieved.